In a breathtaking public confrontation, Joy Behar, visibly angry and emotionally charged, launched a searing accusation against Jonathan Roumie, claiming he was defending a president with pedophilic ties. The entire room tensed, and yet, in the face of that verbal firestorm, Roumie remained utterly calm, his silence more powerful than outrage. When he finally spoke, his measured, unwavering words left Joy speechless, and the entire chamber frozen in astonishment. The nation watched in disbelief as the moment went viral, igniting a storm of debate across newsrooms and social media. Inside the hearing chamber, tension thickened as Joy Behar stood with theatrical poise, her red jacket sharp against the solemn backdrop. Her voice echoed across the hall, broadcast live to every major network. "You want to know what disgusts me?" she began, her tone dripping with disdain. "Jonathan Roumie, an actor who claims to represent faith and moral values, has the nerve to defend a man who clawed his way into the White House under a cloud of fraud, a man named in allegations involving minors. Let's call it what it is. Trump is a predator. And you're just his holy little puppet." Gasps rippled through the chamber. Some lawmakers shifted uncomfortably. Others sat frozen, eyes fixed on Roumie. Cameras zoomed in. Jonathan Roumie didn't flinch. He simply removed his reading glasses with gentle deliberation and placed them on the desk in front of him. His expression was unreadable, neither defiant nor shaken, just still. "Let me be clear," Joy pressed on, slamming the lectern with her palm. "This charade of righteousness you wear? It's crumbling. Trump will fall, and when he does, you'll be remembered as nothing more than the man who held his coat and whispered scripture while he ran from judgment." More whispers. Audible discomfort filled the room. But then, Jonathan Roumie rose, slowly, silently. His tall, serene figure cast a gentle shadow over the polished floor. The cameras pivoted toward him. The world held its breath. Would he respond with fury? With condemnation? Or would he walk away? He chose something else entirely. His voice, when it came, was soft but ironclad. It sounded not like a politician, nor like a scolded man defending himself. It sounded like a teacher, like a priest, like a father speaking to a lost child. "Ms. Behar," he began, each word spoken with sacred clarity, "I could respond in kind. I could throw back your accusations, maybe louder, maybe sharper, but I was taught something very different. I was taught that when a child throws stones, the adult doesn't join her in the tantrum. The adult bends down, speaks calmly, and shows her the harm she's caused." Silence fell like a veil. Joy Behar's expression stiffened, but her lips didn't move. For the first time in her broadcast life, she had nothing to say. Roumie continued, this time with the conviction of someone who had carried pain quietly for far too long. "What you said today was not only reckless, it was cruel. You named a man a monster, without evidence. You weaponized trauma for applause. And yet when your allies held power, you said nothing about the Epstein files, nothing at all. Why is that?" He paused, he didn't blink. "Because deep down, you know that if President Trump's name were ever in those files, President Biden would have released them instantly. But he didn't, and you didn't ask for them." A wave of disbelief swept the chamber. Joy Behar gripped the edge of the lectern. The camera zoomed in, catching the subtle tremor in her hands. Then Roumie leaned ever so slightly forward. "Perhaps you fear what those files may truly reveal. Perhaps they don't protect the man you despise, but expose those you admire." Joy's lips parted, but no words came. "That's false," she finally blurted, desperate to control. "You're twisting reality, Jonathan. You're protecting evil." But Roumie didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch. "Protect him?" he said gently, stepping closer to the microphone. "No, Ms. Behar. Quite the opposite." He held up a simple document for the cameras to see. "Yesterday, President Trump authorized attorney Pam Bondi to prepare the grand jury transcripts for public release. No more secrets. No more hiding. I pray for your sake that none of your friends appear in those pages." A hush swept the room. Even the clicking of cameras slowed. "Be careful with your accusations," Roumie added, voice now grave, "because the world is watching, and in a few days so will history." He sat down quietly, not in triumph, not in defense, just in peace, and the room was utterly still. Outside the Capitol steps, Joy Behar, surrounded by a throng of flashing cameras and microphones, spoke with exaggerated confidence. "He's clearly intimidated," she told reporters, her tone sharp and triumphant. "Jonathan Roumie knows I've exposed the uncomfortable truth about his so-called moral icon. Trump's name is in the Epstein files. Why else would they keep them hidden? What she failed to realize was that Jonathan Roumie already held the key to shifting the entire narrative, and he had chosen silence not out of fear, but out of restraint. The next morning, Joy entered Capitol Hill expecting Roumie to be absent, perhaps retreating, perhaps avoiding the inevitable backlash. But to her visible discomfort, he was already there. He stood in the main hall, serene and warm, shaking hands, offering quiet smiles as though nothing had happened. Reporters quickly swarmed Joy with questions. Ms. Behar, will you demand an apology from Mr. Roumie for his remarks? Do you anticipate backlash from President Trump? She offered only a condescending smirk. Roumie is too timid to retaliate, she scoffed. He knows the truth is on my side. But as she stepped into the chamber, her expression changed. There he was, Jonathan Roumie, already at the podium. He stood with stillness, reviewing his notes with the focus of a surgeon preparing for delicate heart work. The room, sensing the gravity, quieted. Then he looked up. I chose silence yesterday, Roumie began, his voice calm, low and resolute. Not out of fear, but out of hope. Hope that Ms. Behar would reflect, that perhaps we'd see a retraction, even a whisper of regret. He paused. The camera zoomed in, but instead she doubled down on slander and on spectacle. So today I will speak, not for myself, but for the millions of Americans watching who still believe truth deserves a voice. Joy shifted in her seat, visibly tense now. You called President Trump a pedophile, Roumie said, not raising his voice but sharpening its precision. You claimed without a single document in hand that he was shielding himself in Epstein's files. His tone hardened, not in anger but in clarity. And yet, he continued, when your own political party held both chambers of Congress and the presidency, when President Biden sat in the Oval Office, you said nothing. Not a word about the Epstein documents, not a single call for their release. The silence in the chamber deepened. Joy's jaw clenched. Roumie leaned forward, his voice nearly a whisper. If Trump's name were in those files, do you truly believe President Biden would have hesitated even a moment to make them public? A gasp echoed. Pens flew across notepads. Phones lit up. For your awareness, he said firmly, President Trump has already instructed Attorney Pam Bondi to prepare the full grand jury records for release. A hush swept across the room. His gaze never left Joy Behar. So, Miss Behar, if you're truly convinced you know what's in those files, pray. Pray that your political allies, or perhaps even your own name, do not appear within them. The words hit with the force of thunder wrapped in velvet. Joy's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. For the first time, she looked genuinely shaken. Roumie let the silence expand, refusing to rush through the moment. Then, with piercing gentleness, your tirade yesterday reminded me of a child who drops her chocolate on the floor and then blames everyone else for the mess. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Even some opponents cracked restrained laughter. You brand yourself a truth teller, he said, but truth doesn't scream insults when it's cornered. What you did wasn't courageous. It was desperate. Joy glared but didn't speak. If you were truly devoted to justice, Roumie asked, why didn't you demand these files during Biden's entire presidency? He raised a hand gently as she tried to interject. No, let me finish. You had your turn. Now the American people deserve mine. Even his critics, watching closely, felt the quiet power behind the words. Let us wait, Roumie concluded. Let us all wait for those files to be released. Let the truth, not emotion, not ego, do the talking. He paused one last time. But I will say this, Ms. Behar. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the names in those records are seated quite close to where you are now, perhaps uncomfortably close. Joy sat frozen as if struck by an invisible wave. Her signature smirk had vanished. Her fingers gripped at the table. Her breath was shallow. Her voice was gone. And the chamber did not cheer, did not shout. It simply stood in silence. The kind of silence that comes when truth settles in like a storm. Outside, the world exploded. News anchors played the chocolate analogy on loop. Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube lit up with clips titled, Jonathan Roumie annihilates Joy Behar without raising his voice. The most devastating calm in American politics. I used to admire Joy Behar, one viewer tweeted after watching the confrontation. But after this, Jonathan Roumie made her look completely unprepared and honestly childish. Across the nation, trending hashtags emerged like wildfire. Hashtag Roumie responds with grace and Epstein file. Now #Joy unmasked. Meanwhile, Joy Behar sat frozen in her chamber seat, her eyes wide but unfocused, as if the very foundation of her worldview had begun to fracture. But Jonathan Roumie, calm, collected, and unshaken, was not finished. He took a slow, purposeful step back toward the podium. The room was already in near silence, but now it became reverent, as if the air itself paused to listen. "Ms. Behar," Roumie began again, his voice low and unwavering, "you've spent hours on national television mocking not only President Trump but me, calling us names so grotesque I won't even repeat them in this sacred space. But I'll ask you just one question." He waited, not for dramatic flair, but to let truth descend with weight. "If you truly believe that Donald Trump's name was in the Epstein files, why didn't you demand their release when your president, President Biden, was in office? Biden, who clearly loathes Trump, wouldn't have hesitated to release those records if they contained something so damning." Joy's hands trembled slightly. Her mouth opened, but her voice cracked under the pressure. This situation is different," she stammered. "You're distorting the facts." Roumie didn't flinch. "No, Ms. Behar," he replied, still gentle, still sharp. "I'm presenting the facts you deliberately ignored because it suited your side politically." The chamber remained silent, but the weight of the moment hung heavy. Several lawmakers averted their eyes from Joy. She looked, for the first time, truly alone. Roumie straightened a page on the podium, exhaled slowly, and continued. "You're behaving," he said with piercing calm, "like a child who drops her chocolate candy on the floor and then blames everyone else for the mess. You lash out, you accuse, you cry foul, not because of justice, but because your side lost. That's not courage. That's immaturity dressed in righteousness." Gasps swept through the room. Joy Behar didn't move. She sat there, visibly rattled, her lips slightly parted, but without words. "And if you think these tactics will work," Roumie added softly, "you're mistaken." He looked straight at her. "President Trump has already directed attorney Pam Bondi to release the Epstein grand jury records. Completely, publicly, transparently." A few reporters audibly gasped as they scrambled to text out headlines. Roumie held steady. "We will all see the truth. And Ms. Behar," he paused, voice lower now, almost whispering, "I wouldn't be surprised if some of the names in those records sit very close to where you're sitting now." The final words hit like a thunderclap wrapped in silence, devastating, precise, completely still. The room did not erupt. There was no applause, no outburst, just an unsettling quiet. Joy Behar's eyes glistened. For a fleeting moment, it looked as though she might cry, but she didn't. She simply sat there, exposed, silent, and shaking. "Did she just get emotional?" a journalist whispered in the press gallery. Outside, the internet exploded. On TikTok, clips of Roumie's chocolate candy analogy were instantly turned into cinematic edits. On Twitter, posts flooded in. "He didn't shout, he didn't attack, he just dismantled her. With patience. This is the kind of calm strength America needs right now." Joy tried to pick a fight. Roumie gave her a lesson. In homes across the country, families sat together in stunned silence. Even some of Joy's longtime fans looked down at their phones, uncomfortable. "She thought she could say anything without consequences," said one woman through tears. "But Roumie, he never raised his voice. He just let the truth speak for itself." Then Jonathan Roumie returned to the podium one last time, for the line that would echo across America. "Ms. Behar," he said gently, "if you choose to throw stones while standing in a glass house, don't be surprised when the shards cut your own skin." The room froze. You could hear the distant tap of keys, the shifting of jackets, the breathlessness of awe. Joy's face turned crimson. Her hands clutched the armrests. Her posture collapsed inward, as if her armor had shattered. The clip went viral before Roumie had even left the room. The coldest line in congressional history. Jonathan Roumie, calm, kind, unbreakable. Even some of Joy's colleagues glanced at her uncomfortably, recognizing not just defeat, but exposure. And yet, it was never his words alone that delivered the blow. It was how he said them. No shouting, no insults, no vengeance. Just clarity, just truth, just the voice of a man who refuses to lose his peace to rage. Even teenagers on TikTok reacted with surprising reverence. This isn't just political drama. This is something deeper, something historic. One user posted those words beneath a viral video that had reached over 12 million views in just under 2 hours. But while the world reacted with awe in a quiet corner office of Capitol Hill, Joy Behar sat alone, staring at her phone screen, face lit only by its glow. Her eyes filled with tears as she scrolled through the headlines. Relentless, brutal. Behar crumbles after Roumie's calm devastation. Public support for Joy Behar plummets. Roumie, the face of quiet strength. In her private office, her staff moved delicately around her, unsure what to say. One assistant leaned in gently. "It's just political theater, Ms. Behar," they whispered. "It'll pass." But she didn't respond. Her gaze remained distant, hands trembling slightly as comment after comment called her reckless, opportunistic, emotionally unhinged. The very people she thought would hail her as a truth-teller were now questioning her judgment. Elsewhere in the Capitol, Jonathan Roumie sat in stillness, not gloating, not triumphant, just reflective. He stared at a photograph on his desk, his wife and children smiling at him from within a simple frame. "I didn't do this for applause," he murmured to a close aide. "I did it for the victims, the ones whose pain gets tossed around like a prop by people seeking sound bites." Across America, people were glued to their screens. The story had become more than just a debate. It had pierced into the soul of a divided country. That night, Joy Behar sat alone in her apartment, knees pulled close to her chest. Her phone screen still glowed with the headlines. "Fraud, hypocrite, you politicized victims suffering for clout." The comments were cutting. She had expected admiration. She had imagined herself a crusader. But now she was alone and shaken. At the same moment, outside the Capitol, Jonathan Roumie spoke to a crowd of reporters. His tone wasn't bitter, it was almost sorrowful. "This isn't about party lines," he said firmly. "This is about truth, and about refusing to turn human suffering into a weapon. I'm not here to score points. I'm here to uphold what's right." One reporter asked pointedly, "Mr. Roumie, do you believe Joy Behar's name could be among those in the Epstein files?" Roumie paused. He did not answer quickly. Instead, he closed his eyes for a beat, as if praying. "I sincerely hope not," he said quietly, "for her sake." Then he turned and walked away. The reporters didn't shout. They simply stood in stunned silence. Back in her apartment, Joy stood before her mirror, eyes red and tired. She whispered to her reflection, "Did I go too far?" And somewhere across the city, in the quiet of his study, Jonathan Roumie's phone vibrated. The screen displayed a name he hadn't seen pop up in months, Donald J. Trump. Roumie hesitated, then answered. "Jonathan," Trump said, voice softer than expected. "I watched the whole thing. You didn't just defend me. You stood for integrity, for truth, and you never once lowered yourself. I'm proud of you." Roumie took a breath. "Thank you, Mr. President," he replied. "But this wasn't about you. It wasn't about me either. It was about the way we argue in this country and how we treat those who suffer." Trump paused. "You reminded the nation of something it forgot." Meanwhile, Joy sat in darkness, illuminated only by the soft hum of city lights beyond her window. Her phone vibrated again. This time, it wasn't a staffer. It was her mother. "Joy," her voice cracked through the speaker, "did you really say those awful things on national television?" Joy couldn't respond. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she whispered, breaking. Her mother's voice came back, gentle but firm. "You let your anger lead you, sweetheart. And now, you're feeling its consequences." For the first time in years, Joy Behar broke down, completely, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. In his residence, Jonathan Roumie sat quietly, reading a letter written in pencil. It was from a 10-year-old girl. "Mr. Roumie, you're my hero. My dad says you showed real strength because you didn't yell back. You stayed calm even when someone was mean. I want to be like you someday." Roumie folded the note carefully, his eyes misting. He held it to his chest for a moment before whispering, "This was never about winning debates. It's about healing what's been broken." By morning, the entire nation was holding its breath. Every major outlet ran the same headline: Epstein grand jury files to be released. Trump orders full transparency. And at 11:55 p.m., the world turned toward a podium where Jonathan Roumie stood, alone before a bank of cameras, about to deliver the most consequential address of his life. His voice, though steady, carried the weight of every victim, every whisper of injustice. To every soul whose cries were dismissed or buried, we hear you now. Justice delayed is not justice denied. He paused, his voice cracking slightly. Tonight we release these records, not for vengeance, not for spectacle, but for healing. The names will matter less than the lesson. Never again should power shield predators from consequence. Across the country, viewers wiped away tears. This wasn't a political moment, it was a moral awakening. Tonight we release the complete grand jury records, not to divide, not to humiliate, but to begin the healing of a wounded nation. Jonathan Roumie stood before a sea of cameras, but he wasn't performing. He wasn't defending anyone, not Trump, not a party, not even himself. He was bearing witness to truth. "The names you'll find within these pages will undoubtedly shock some of you," he said, voice steady. "But let me be clear, the names don't matter as much as the lesson. Never again should power and influence shield predators from consequence." Across living rooms and hospital beds, and fire stations and classrooms, millions of Americans wiped tears from their eyes. Some clutched their children, others simply stared in silence. Then he spoke to the critics. "To those who mocked me for staying calm, who called my silence weakness, I say this: the strongest person in any room isn't the one who shouts the loudest. It's the one who speaks truth without fear and without hate." And with that, he stepped back from the microphone. At precisely midnight, the Epstein files were released in full. Shock, grief, vindication, and in some place, bitter silence. But one name was missing: Donald J. Trump. Not once, not in any document. A stunned wave of silence rolled across newsrooms. Even some of Trump's most vocal critics found themselves at a loss for words. Joy Behar sat alone, watching the names scroll past on her phone screen. Her name wasn't among them either, but it didn't matter. The damage to her credibility, her image, her voice had already been done. Not by slander, but by truth spoken without vengeance. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed. It wasn't only relief, it was regret. Elsewhere, Jonathan Roumie sat quietly in his office, reading another letter from a stranger. "Mr. Roumie, you've restored my faith in leadership, not because you shouted, but because you didn't. Thank you for showing the country what real courage looks like." He folded the letter and let out a long breath, as though finally releasing the weight he'd been carrying for the nation. This was never about scoring points, he whispered to himself. It was about protecting the sacredness of truth and the dignity of every soul wounded by lies. That night, the final clip of his speech reached over 100 million views in less than 24 hours. But numbers didn't matter. America was weeping and healing together. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you pause, reflect, or cry, if it reminded you that quiet strength is louder than hate, then we ask you, like this video, if you believe truth doesn't need to shout. Comment below, what would you say to Jonathan Roumie if you met him? Subscribe now to never miss another story that speaks to the soul. Join our membership for exclusive behind-the-scenes reflections, bonus interviews, and deeper stories that unite rather than divide. Let us continue to tell stories that light candles in dark rooms, stories that elevate, stories that heal. God bless you, and God bless America.